White woman calls police on black teen, speechless when his mom arrives and she's the mayor. Music for the motion has been making the rounds. In a heart-stopping moment at Oakwood Park, a white woman, driven by suspicion, calls the police on a black teenager quietly sketching on a park bench. Her assumptions unravel in an instant when the boy's mother arrives, none other than Angela Thompson, the city's mayor. With unwavering authority and a mother's protective instinct, Angela confronts the woman, turning an everyday scene into a powerful statement on bias and justice. What begins as an unsettling encounter becomes a catalyst for change, challenging everyone present to reflect on their actions. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. If you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. And now, Jeremiah perched on the edge of a weathered park bench, pencil in hand, sketching the fluid motion of children on the swings, his notebook balanced on his knee, pages filled with sketches of trees, flowers, and people frozen mid-action. A snapshot of the park's vibrant life. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows across Oakwood Park, a sanctuary of calm nestled in the bustling heart of the city. For Jeremiah, the park was more than just a public space. It was his escape, a haven where he could sketch uninterrupted, away from the pressures of school and the watchful gaze of his mother, Angela Thompson. Angela, the mayor of Oakwood, was a formidable figure, a woman whose voice commanded attention in city council chambers and whose policies shaped the lives of thousands. But to Jeremiah, she was just mom, someone who worried too much about his grades, his safety, and whether he was eating enough vegetables. While Angela spent her afternoons in meetings and press conferences, Jeremiah often retreated to the park to drawl, a quiet rebellion against the chaos of his mother's world. Across the park, Sarah Hill sat rigid on another bench, her eyes fixed on Jeremiah. Her day had been a whirlwind of frustrations, a botched presentation at work, a missed call from her daughter's school, and now a long wait for a friend who had yet to show up. She clutched her purse tightly, the coil of unease in her chest tightening as she observed Jeremiah. She didn't know why, but something about him unsettled her. The way he sat there, so calm and composed, felt out of place in her tightly wound world. Nearby, a mother crouched next to her daughter, patiently explaining why the park was a shared space meant for everyone. The little girl, her curly hair catching the golden sunlight, giggled as she twirled in circles, her laughter cutting through the ambient noise of chatter, the rhythmic creak of swings, and the occasional bark of a dog. But Sarah barely noticed, her focus locked on Jeremiah and his sketchbook. Jeremiah flipped to a new page, his movements slow and deliberate. He loved the way light played on the children's faces, the way shadows shifted as they swung higher and higher. It was a challenge to capture motion on paper, but he relished it. For a moment, the world outside the bounds of his sketchbook ceased to exist. Sarah's discomfort bubbled to the surface. Her mind raced with questions. Why is he sitting there? What's he drawing? Who waits this long in a park alone? She glanced at her watch and then back at Jeremiah. Every passing second intensified her unease, her instincts urging her to act. The tension in the air was palpable, though unspoken. Across the park, life continued. A game of frisbee, a jogger tying their shoe, a dog chasing a squirrel. Yet here, in this small corner of Oakwood Park, the stage was quietly set for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond its bounds. Jeremiah flipped the page of his sketchbook, letting the hum of the park fade into the background as he focused on the motion of a child leaping off a swing. His pencil danced over the paper, the lines taking form with ease. Lost in his creative flow, he didn't notice the figure approaching until a shadow stretched across his sketchbook, cutting off the warm sunlight. A voice broke through his concentration, sharp and invasive. "Excuse me? What exactly are you doing here?" "Sir, step away from the display circuit and touch the control panel." Jeremiah's head snapped up, his heart skipping a beat. The woman's face was tight, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Her presence loomed, an unwelcome interruption to his peaceful moment. "I'm just drawing," he replied evenly, his voice careful, calm. "Waiting for my mom." The woman didn't seem convinced. She tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line as she surveyed him. There was no warmth in her gaze, only a quiet challenge. Jeremiah could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. "How long have you been waiting?" she demanded, her arms folding across her chest. "Kids like you think they can hang around anywhere and—" "Ma'am," Jeremiah interrupted, his voice firmer this time. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The tension in the air thickened, crackling like static before a storm. She stared at him, her jaw tightening, as if his words only confirmed whatever suspicions she held. Jeremiah held her gaze, refusing to look away. He wasn't about to let himself appear guilty of something he hadn't done. The woman's face hardened further, her discomfort transforming into something colder, sharper. "We'll see about that," she muttered, digging into her purse. A moment later, her phone was in her hand and she was dialing. Her voice trembled, but carried a sense of grim determination as she said, "I'm calling the police." Jeremiah felt a jolt of panic, though he forced himself to stay still. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Stay calm, don't escalate." He straightened his posture, resting his hands on his knees where she could see them. "Ma'am, there's no need for that," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. "I'm just here to draw, that's all." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes darted to the phone as she relayed a brief clipped message to the dispatcher. "Yes, there's a young man here at Oakwood Park acting suspiciously. He refuses to leave when asked." Her gaze flicked back to him, sharp and accusing. Jeremiah opened his mouth to protest, but a jogger passing by slowed, their steps faltering as they took in the scene. Their brows furrowed, though they didn't stop. Further away, a mother sitting on a nearby bench pulled her daughter close, whispering something while glancing nervously in Jeremiah's direction. The world seemed to narrow around him. The vibrant noise of the park dulled to a low hum, overtaken by the pounding of his heart. He caught sight of a middle-aged man in a baseball cap lingering nearby. Their eyes met briefly, and Jeremiah hoped, prayed for some intervention. But the man hesitated, then turned away, shaking his head as if deciding it wasn't his business. Jeremiah sat frozen, his sketchbook forgotten on his lap. A part of him wanted to run, to escape the weight of the woman's gaze and the implications in her voice. But another part of him knew better. Running would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on breathing, on keeping his face calm even as fear clawed at his chest. "Ma'am, this really isn't necessary." He tried again, his voice quieter now. But she had already turned away, her focus on the approaching sirens growing louder in the distance. The tension in the air rippled outward. More people were watching now, their whispers blending with the rhythmic screech of the swings and the bark of a distant dog. Jeremiah felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others wary. The golden light of the late afternoon seemed to dim, swallowed by a growing shadow of unease. Time stretched painfully thin. Jeremiah's fingers gripped the edges of his sketchbook, the paper crinkling under the pressure. He didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain: the peace of his quiet afternoon had been irrevocably shattered. Jeremiah rose slowly from the bench, his hands visible and open at his sides. The weight of the moment bore down on him, each passing second stretching into an eternity. He kept his breathing steady, though the rapid thrum of his heart betrayed his growing fear. Around him, the usual sounds of the park, the children laughing, the dogs barking, seemed muted, as though the world was holding its breath. Ajagra slowed his pace, his steps faltering as he took in the scene. His gaze darted between Jeremiah and Sarah, his expression a mixture of confusion and unease. For a moment, it seemed like he might intervene, but then he simply shook his head and continued on his way, his pace quickening. Nearby, a woman in yoga pants paused mid-conversation, her hand gripping her phone tightly. She whispered something to her friend. who glanced toward Jeremiah with a furrowed brow, but ultimately turned away, resuming their walk as though nothing was happening. The first sign of action came from a middle-aged man wearing a faded baseball cap. He had been leaning against a tree, observing quietly until now. Stepping forward, he called out, his voice steady but cautious. "Lady, he's not doing anything wrong. He's just sitting there." The words cut through the tense silence, drawing the attention of others in the park. Jeremiah felt a flicker of hope, a small spark of relief at the man's defense. But it was short-lived. Sarah spun around, her posture rigid and her expression tight with indignation. "And you think you know better?" she snapped, her voice rising. "It's not your safety at risk. You don't know what he might be planning." The man's eyes widened slightly at her intensity. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, stepping back. "Look, I'm just saying, I don't think he's bothering anyone." He lifted his head, staring at her. She saw the furrow between his eyebrows. "Possible? Well, it's not your concern," Sarah shot back, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "You don't have to feel threatened, but I do." Her words echoed, hanging in the air as the man hesitated. His gaze shifted briefly to Jeremiah, who met his eyes with a silent plea. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might hold his ground, but then he shook his head, muttering under his breath as he turned and walked away. Jeremiah's shoulders sagged slightly, the fleeting glimmer of hope extinguished. He felt the sting of disappointment, the quiet resignation that came with realizing he was alone in this. The onlookers had become a growing crowd, their whispers rising as more people stopped to watch. Some recorded the scene on their phones, their screens reflecting Jeremiah's tense posture and Sarah's accusing stance. One woman clutched her child's hand tightly, pulling them closer as she whispered something urgent in their ear. Another man, dressed in business attire, glanced at his watch before shaking his head and walking briskly toward the park's exit. The park's usual atmosphere of casual relaxation had been replaced with a simmering tension, the air heavy with judgment and unease. The approaching sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the chatter and drawing the crowd's collective attention. A hush fell over the group as the flashing lights of a police cruiser came into view. The crowd shifted, some moving closer to see what would happen next, others stepping back, as though trying to distance themselves from the unfolding situation. Jeremiah's breath hitched as he watched the patrol car pull to a stop just a few yards away. His mother's warnings played on a loop in his mind, her voice urging him to remain calm, to keep his hands visible, to say nothing unless directly asked. The weight of those lessons pressed down on him now, every detail feeling suddenly critical. The doors of the cruiser opened, and two officers stepped out, their movements deliberate and measured. The taller of the two scanned the scene with a practiced gaze, his hand resting lightly on his belt. The other, younger and wiry, focused immediately on Sarah, who was already walking toward them, her phone still clutched in her hand. Jeremiah stood frozen, his heart pounding as the officers moved closer. The world around him seemed to shrink, the crowd, the park, the golden afternoon, all of it fading into the background as the weight of the moment bore down on him. He didn't know what was about to happen, but every instinct told him it wouldn't be good. The sirens faded as the patrol car came to a stop, its lights casting red and blue reflections on the nearby trees. Jeremiah's pulse quickened, his mother's instructions looping in his mind like a mantra. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't give them an excuse. His fingers curled into fists, not in defiance but in an attempt to steady himself. He placed them firmly at his sides, visible to anyone watching. The officer stepped out, their boots crunching softly against the gravel path. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, adjusted his belt as he scanned the scene with a seasoned gaze, his expression unreadable. His partner, Officer Cruz, smaller and wiry, moved with sharp precision, his eyes flicking between Jeremiah, Sarah, and the growing crowd. Daniel spoke first, his tone neutral but commanding. "What's going on here?" Before Jeremiah could form a response, Sarah surged forward, her earlier indignation replaced by a triumphant righteousness. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here," she began, her voice trembling just enough to underscore her urgency. "This young man has been loitering and acting suspiciously. I asked him to leave, but he refused." Jeremiah inhaled sharply, his chest tightening as her words landed with weight he couldn't counter fast enough. He took a step forward, his voice steady, but tinged with frustration. "I wasn't loitering," he began, his hands gesturing toward his sketchbook on the bench. "I'm just waiting for my—" Cruz cut him off, his hand raised to silence him. "We'll get to you in a moment," he said curtly, his attention still fixed on Sarah. Jeremiah froze mid-sentence, his words dying in his throat. His jaw clenched, but he took a step back, forcing himself to stay still. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, now larger and more focused. Phones were held aloft, their lenses capturing the scene. Whispers rippled through the gathering, a low hum of speculation and tension. Sarah, emboldened by the officer's presence, launched into a detailed recounting of the events. Her voice grew louder, her gestures more animated as she described what she perceived as Jeremiah's suspicious behavior. Each word felt like a stone hurled in his direction, their weight heavy and unfair. "He was sitting there for so long just watching," Sarah said, her tone sharpening. "I didn't know what he might be planning. I asked him to leave nicely, but he refused to listen." Daniels nodded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Jeremiah. "Is that true? Were you asked to leave?" "But the Janice—" Jeremiah's heart raced as he met the officer's gaze. He opened his mouth to respond, but a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. His voice emerged quieter than he intended. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just drawing." Daniels raised an eyebrow, glancing at the sketchbook still lying on the bench. He moved toward it, crouching down to flip through the pages. The sound of rustling paper broke the silence, and for a moment, the tension shifted. Jeremiah watched nervously, unsure of what the officer might see or what he might interpret. Cruz, meanwhile, stepped closer to Sarah, his voice low and even. "You mentioned he refused to leave. Did he threaten you in any way?" Sarah hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Not directly," she admitted, though her tone was defensive. "But he wouldn't listen. He was defiant." Cruz frowned slightly, glancing back at Daniels, who stood and dusted off his hands. "Looks like drawings to me," Daniels said, his tone unreadable. He turned back to Jeremiah, his expression neutral but probing. "Do you have someone you're waiting for?" Jeremiah nodded quickly. "My mom. She's working nearby and told me to wait here." Daniels considered him for a moment, his gaze shifting between Jeremiah and Sarah. The growing crowd was silent now, their attention fixed on the scene. A child's voice broke through, asking their parent, "What's happening?" only to be hushed quickly. "Do you have ID on you?" Daniels asked, his tone softening slightly. Jeremiah's stomach sank, and he shook his head. "No, sir. Just my sketchbook." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Cruz turned back to Sarah, his tone slightly more pointed. "Ma'am, did you see him doing anything that seemed like a threat? Any behavior that gave you reason to believe he was dangerous?" Sarah's confidence wavered, her posture stiffening. I just had a feeling," she stammered. He looked out of place. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others watching with silent anticipation. Daniels sighed, stepping back to address Jeremiah. "All right, just stay where you are while we sort this out." Jeremiah nodded, his hands still at his sides, trembling slightly as the weight of the moment bore down on him. He glanced toward the crowd again, hoping for someone to step forward, to say something that would end this. But the silence remained, thick and suffocating. The situation hung precariously, the balance between escalation and resolution as fragile as the tension that surrounded them. The sleek black SUV glided to a stop just beyond the patrol car, its polished surface catching the last rays of the afternoon sun. As the door opened, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. From the vehicle emerged Mayor Angela Thompson, her posture straight, her heels clicking against the pavement with a sound that demanded attention. The air seemed to shift as her presence filled the space, the authority she carried palpable. Her gaze swept the scene, taking in the officers, Sarah, the crowd, and finally Jeremiah, who stood frozen, his hands still visible at his sides. Her jaw tightened, but her expression remained controlled, a mask of cold fury hiding the storm brewing beneath. "What is happening here?" Angela's voice cut through the tension like a blade, crisp and unwavering. Officer Daniels stiffened, instinctively straightening his posture. His initial confidence wavered under her sharp gaze. "Ma'am, we were responding to a call," he began, his tone measured. Angela raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Her voice, though steady, carried an edge that left no room for interruption. "A call about what? My son? Based on what evidence?" The crowd stirred, the energy shifting as people whispered to one another. Some glanced at Sarah, whose confidence seemed to crumble as she took an involuntary step back. Her earlier righteousness faded, replaced by visible unease. "I didn't know," Sarah began, her voice faltering. Angela turned on her, her words swift and unrelenting. "That he was my son? Would it have mattered? Or is it the fact that he's a black boy in a public park that you couldn't tolerate?" Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her gaze darted between Angela and Jeremiah, her composure unraveling. The crowd watched in silence, their collective attention drawn to the confrontation. The tension that had gripped the park now shifted, centering on Angela's commanding presence. Jeremiah's eyes met his mother's, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a flicker of safety. Her arrival was like a shield, her strength a balm to his fraying nerves. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding in until that moment, when her presence reminded him he wasn't alone. A deep voice escorted him from his meetings. Angela turned her attention to the officers, her expression hardening. "Explain to me why two uniformed officers are questioning my son for sitting on a park bench with a sketchbook." Her tone left no room for evasion. Daniels cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Ma'am, the call we received described suspicious behavior. We were following up." "Suspicious behavior?" Angela interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Sketching in a public park is now suspicious, or is it that his presence didn't fit someone's biased idea of who belongs here?" Cruz shifted uncomfortably, his hand lowering from his belt as he glanced at Daniels. The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. The crowd, once murmuring, had gone completely silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Sarah, still rooted in place, tried again. I didn't mean..." Her voice trailed off, her earlier certainty crumbling under Angela's unrelenting gaze. Angela took a step closer to her, her voice quieter but no less forceful. "You didn't mean to what? Profile him? Criminalize his existence in a space he has every right to be in? Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions could have cost my son far more than just his afternoon." The words hit Sarah like a blow, and she visibly recoiled, her face pale. She opened her mouth as though to respond, but no defense seemed adequate. Her shoulders sagged as the realization of the situation fully sank in. Angela turned back to the officers, her tone softening but retaining its authority. "Release him. Now. And I expect a full explanation of this incident on my desk by tomorrow morning." Daniels nodded stiffly, gesturing to Cruz, who stepped back without a word. Angela's gaze returned to Jeremiah, her expression softening as she approached him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Jeremiah nodded, though his voice wavered. "I'm fine, Mom. Angela straightened, her eyes scanning the crowd, her voice rising just enough to address everyone. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every child who has been judged for how they look instead of who they are. This is why we must confront our biases and hold ourselves accountable." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply. The crowd began to shift, their faces reflecting a mix of shame, understanding, and reflection. Some phones were lowered, their owners realizing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Sarah looked down, her hands gripping the strap of her purse as if searching for an anchor. As the officers returned to their cruiser and the crowd began to disperse, Angela stood beside Jeremiah, her hand never leaving his shoulder. The golden light of the afternoon began to fade, but her presence remained, unyielding and steady. In that moment, she was more than a mayor, more than a parent. She was a force, standing against the weight of prejudice and fear. For the first time, Sarah's certainty faltered, the cracks in her resolve widening as she truly saw the boy before her. Jeremiah was no longer the blurry image of a threat her mind had conjured. He was a teenager, his hands trembling, his sketchbook discarded on the bench like a casualty of misplaced fear. The edges of his figure seemed smaller now, less imposing, his expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet resilience. Her gaze lingered on the sketchbook, pages filled with drawings, trees, children playing, the serene life of the park, peeked out beneath the worn cover. They weren't the works of someone dangerous. They were the careful creations of an artist. A boy. Just a boy, she realized, the thought settling in her chest like a weight. Her mind raced as guilt clawed its way forward. What if I was wrong? The question echoed relentlessly. She replayed the scene in her mind, the way she had approached him, the sharpness in her tone, the call she had made without hesitation. What if the officers had reacted differently? What if the situation had spiraled out of control? The thought sent a shiver through her. Yet guilt wasn't alone in her heart. Pride, wounded and stubborn, reared its head. I was just trying to protect myself, she reasoned, clinging to the idea. She had acted on instinct, hadn't she? Her intentions hadn't been malicious. But even as she tried to justify her actions, the hollow nature of the excuses rang clear. Angela's words replayed in her mind. Your intentions don't matter as much as your actions. It was true. No matter her reasoning, she had put a boy in harm's way simply because she felt uneasy. She had judged him, unfairly and harshly, and now that realization burned. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the lingering whispers and disapproving glances stung. Sarah's chest tightened as she noticed a mother pulling her child closer, casting her a look that mixed disappointment with reproach. She wanted to explain herself, to say something, anything, that might make them see she wasn't a bad person. But she remained silent, trapped between shame and defensiveness. Her eyes drifted back to Jeremiah and Angela. The boy stood close to his mother now, her protective presence shielding him from further scrutiny. Sarah could see the pain in Angela's eyes, the weight of a parent forced to protect her child from a world that too often saw him as less than human. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. She had been part of that world today, part of the problem. She hadn't wanted to be, but wanting wasn't enough. Actions mattered. She knew that now, even if the knowledge came too late to undo the damage. Angela's hand lingered on Jeremiah's shoulder, a steadying presence that grounded both of them. The weight of the moment was palpable, her anger and disappointment still simmering beneath her calm exterior. But, as she looked at her son, her expression softened, the fierce protector giving way to the loving mother. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice quieter now, meant only for him. Jeremiah hesitated before nodding, his voice shaky but resolute. "I'm fine, Mom." Angela nodded back, her hand squeezing his shoulder gently. but her gaze lifted to the onlookers who remained. There was no mistaking the weight of her words as she addressed them. "This," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the park, "is why we must confront our biases. What happened here today is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger problem." The crowd, now subdued, listened in silence. A few exchanged glances, the gravity of her words sinking in. Others looked at the ground, uncomfortable yet unable to walk away. Angela's words weren't just a condemnation. They were a call to reflect, to acknowledge the silent complicity of watching injustice unfold. Then, from the edge of the group, Sarah stepped forward. Her movements were hesitant, her shoulders drawn inward as though trying to make herself smaller. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she managed, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Her voice wavered, barely audible. Angela turned to face her fully. The mayor's gaze, though not as fiery as before, remained steady. "Your intentions," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "don't matter as much as your actions. What you did here today could have escalated into something far worse. It's not enough to mean well. You need to do better. Learn from this." Sarah's face flushed, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She nodded slowly, her eyes flickering to Jeremiah, who was watching her with a guarded expression. She wanted to say more, to find words that might undo the damage, but none came. She lowered her gaze, stepping back into the crowd, her presence shrinking into the background. Angela returned her focus to Jeremiah, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "You're brave," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth meant only for him. "But you shouldn't have to be." Jeremiah didn't reply, but the small nod he gave spoke volumes. He looked down at his sketchbook, now back in his hands, and traced a finger along the edge of its cover. A quiet moment passed between them, one of shared understanding. In the days that followed, the incident became the catalyst for a wave of conversations across the city. Angela wasted no time addressing the issue publicly during a city council meeting. "This is not just about my son," she told the room, her voice unwavering. "It's about the systems and attitudes that allow moments like this to happen. We need change, and that starts with us." Anti-bias training programs were implemented in schools and city departments, met with both praise and resistance. Angela faced pushback, as she had expected, but she pressed forward, her resolve unshaken. "It's not enough to hope for a better future," she said during a televised interview. "We have to build it." Jeremiah, too, found his voice in the aftermath. When asked to share his story at a school assembly, he agreed reluctantly at first. But standing before his peers, his hands clutching his sketchbook, he spoke with a quiet strength. "This isn't just my story," he said. "It's about all of us. We need to see each other for who we really are, not what we assume." The park became a place of transformation in the months that followed. Murals of unity began to appear on its walls, painted by local artists, including Jeremiah. His sketches grew bolder, reflecting not just the beauty of the park, but also the strength of the community that was trying, imperfectly, to change. One evening, as Jeremiah and Angela walked through the park, she turned to him with a smile. "You're stronger than I ever knew," she said. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I had a good example." They walked on, the sun setting behind them, casting a warm glow over the park. The incident had left its mark, but so had the resilience it revealed, and the hope it inspired. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the incident at Oakwood Park spread far and wide. What began as a tense and isolating moment for Jeremiah had grown into a citywide dialogue. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Angela's calls for systemic change and sparking debates in living rooms, classrooms, and council chambers. Angela pushed forward, her leadership unwavering despite the resistance. The anti-bias training programs she championed became a reality, though not without their share of opposition. Critics labeled the initiative unnecessary or divisive, but Angela stood firm. "Acknowledging our biases doesn't weaken us," she said in a public address. "It strengthens our ability to see each other as human." Jeremiah, too, found himself swept into the momentum of change. At first, he resisted the idea of sharing his experience publicly. The memory of that day still lingered: Sarah's accusatory tone, the officer's scrutinizing gazes, the silent weight of the crowd. But as he saw how his story had ignited conversations, he began to see the power in his voice. When he finally stepped onto the stage at his school assembly, sketchbook in hand, his heart pounded in his chest, but as he spoke, his voice grew steady, carrying the truth of what he had lived. "This wasn't just about me," he told his peers. "It's about how we see each other and how we choose to act when it matters." His words left an impact, sparking thoughtful discussions among his classmates. Some of his friends apologized, admitting they had never thought about what it felt like to walk in his shoes. Others began speaking up when they saw moments of unfairness, no longer content to stay silent. Back at the park, changes were visible too. The once tense space slowly became a symbol of healing. Local artists came together to paint vibrant murals on the park's walls, each one a testament to unity and hope. Jeremiah contributed a piece, a simple yet striking sketch of two hands reaching out, bridging a gap. Sitting on the same weathered bench where everything began, Jeremiah often found himself sketching again. But this time, he didn't feel the weight of eyes judging him. Instead, he noticed something different: people smiling as they passed, kids waving to him, strangers stopping to compliment his art. The park felt lighter, as though the air itself had been cleared. One evening, as Angela prepared dinner, Jeremiah leaned against the counter, flipping through his sketchbook. She glanced over, her expression softening. "You've been quiet," she said. "What's on your mind?" He paused, running his fingers over a fresh page filled with sketches of the park's murals. "Do you think it'll really change?" he asked, his voice quiet but earnest. "I mean, like, really change?" Angela turned to him, her face thoughtful. "Change isn't fast," she said after a moment. "It's messy and imperfect. But it starts with moments like this. And moments like this need people like you, people willing to stand up, even when it's hard." Jeremiah nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't feel like a hero or an activist. He was just a kid who loved to draw. But maybe, he thought, that was enough. A few days later, Jeremiah returned to the park, sketchbook in hand. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the scene in warmth, just as it had on that fateful day. But something felt different now. He no longer noticed suspicion in the faces around him. Instead, he saw small, quiet signs of a community trying, slowly, imperfectly, to be better. As he flipped to a blank page and began to draw, Jeremiah glanced up at the park around him. Children laughed on the swings, a jogger waved as they passed, and a woman smiled at him from across the path. He smiled back, his pencil moving over the page. The image began to take shape. A park full of life, color, and connection. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was a start, and sometimes a start was everything. The weight of the moment passed, leaving in its place a quiet hope that lingered like the fading light of the sun. The park, like the people within it, held the potential to grow, to heal, to become something more. And that was enough to believe in.